AP Biology. Today we're going to talk about energy transformations and ATP, and this fits into our unit on energy where we're also going to talk about enzymes and cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So what you can see on this slide is a couple of squid and bioluminescence. So what they're doing is converting chemical energy from their food into light energy. So cool, right? Okay, and then I just want to run through a few forms of energy. You don't have to memorize kinetic energy. You've probably learned about it in the past, but kinetic energy is energy of motion, and it's just one form of energy. Thermal energy or heat energy is associated with the random movements of atoms or molecules, just the vibrations. So we do talk about that one. So you should know that one. Gravitational potential energy, you do not need to know, but you probably know this one already, and so it's just another example of a form of energy. Pretend that this car actually has its wheels on the ground. So you can imagine it up here. All of its energy is gravitational potential energy and none of it is kinetic. But when it starts to move down the hill and starts to move faster, it has its energy in kinetic energy. And so by the time it gets to the bottom of the hill, it has no gravitational potential energy, but all kinetic energy, all energy of motion. So the idea here is that energy can be converted from one form to another. Chemical energy is a type of potential energy, but it's potential energy that's available in chemical bonds. And so that can be released in a chemical reaction. In biology, we are using chemical energy a lot of the time. So I ate and I digested that food and brought the smaller molecules like glucose to my cells, and then my mitochondria will convert that chemical energy to another type of chemical energy, ATP. Okay, laws of thermodynamics or laws of energy transformation. You really don't have to memorize the first or the second law of thermodynamics, but the first law is that energy can be transferred or transformed, but it cannot be created or destroyed. So I don't care if you memorize what is the first law of thermodynamics, but you do have to understand the concepts. So don't write an essay where you say the mitochondria creates energy. It absolutely does not. The mitochondria transforms energy. So it can convert energy in glucose to energy in ATP. You can create ATP or make them out of ADP, but you're not creating energy. Again, you're not actually destroying energy either. So this horse, for example, I can see it's kind of sweating here. So it's converting its chemical energy to energy of motion and to heat energy. And there's electrical energy in there because the horse has to move its muscles. So there are a lot of energy conversions, and it might seem like, oh, that heat, that's just destroyed energy. It's not. It's still energy. It's just not usable energy after the heat leaves the horse. So the second law of thermodynamics, and I don't care if you have this one memorized either, but I do want you to understand what it means. This is entropy. So no energy transformation is 100% efficient. So here's an elephant, and you can see it with a thermal camera. And so that elephant has converted chemical energy in food to ATP, which is another type of chemical energy, but then that can get converted to electrical energy. So it has the sodiums outside of the neurons in the muscle cells. Maybe the calcium is in the endoplasmic reticulum. It's also converted some of the energy to motion, right, because the muscles are contracting. And it's converted some of that energy into heat. So that energy that's converted into heat, it's not destroyed, but it's not usable energy anymore. And so we say that the transformation isn't 100% efficient because 100% of that food that it ate, 100% of the energy hasn't been converted into motion or whatever it's supposed to be converted into. Some of it's always lost as heat. So an example of this from your own life might be when you drive somewhere in a car, you're converting the chemical energy from gasoline, right, hydrocarbons, into mechanical or kinetic energy, energy of motion, right? But it's not 100% efficient. Some of the energy is lost as heat, and you know that because when you put your hand on the hood, when you get out of the car, you can see that it's warmed up. Okay, this is a kind of ridiculous picture of entropy. Entropy is the disorder of the universe. which is sort of like this room. What you should think about, and entropy isn't really on the AP curriculum as much as it used to be, but I still want you to be able to think in terms of entropy. So entropy is the disorder of a system, but it's really the number of different ways something can be. So the room sort of has one way to be neat, but a million different ways to be messy. You know, you can throw your sweatshirt on the bureau or on the desk or on the floor or under the bed or on the bed or on the top bunk, right? There's a whole lot of ways for a system to be disordered. And that's really that second law of thermodynamics. Okay, spontaneous processes. So when you think of something spontaneous, you might be thinking of the term, the definition in English. So like my mom was really spontaneous. She was so much fun. She would like walk into the room and, you know, maybe get us to get up and go dancing, you know, like in the kitchen kind of stuff. She was a lot of fun. And so that's the definition in English. In science, in chemistry, that is not the definition. Spontaneous processes are just thermodynamically favorable processes. It's a process. Let's see if I have a pen somewhere. It's a process in which energy is released. So if you have energy over here and the reaction, oops, going this way, this would be a spontaneous process because it's thermodynamically favorable. You have a lot of energy in the reactants, and then in the products, not so much energy. Energy has been lost. That would be a spontaneous process. It does not mean it's going to happen fast. These can happen quickly, or they can happen slowly. So spontaneous processes don't refer to the speed of a reaction. They just say that it is thermodynamically feasible. It's something that is favorable to happen. So for a process to occur without energy input, it has to increase the entropy of the universe. So you're releasing either energy in the form of heat, or you're increasing the entropy, meaning the disorder or the number of different states that something can be in. So imagine a stopcock here turned so that this compartment is separate from that compartment, and you've got a bunch of molecules here. When you turn this stopcock, it opens up a valve here, and now materials can move through. And then pretty soon, every particle that was separated is now spread out through the whole thing. That is a spontaneous process. So that sort of increased the disorder because stuff is sort of spread out all over the place. So this would be a spontaneous, oops, this would be a spontaneous reaction. This one would not be a spontaneous reaction because the materials are spread out and then you squish them all over on one side afterwards. So it would take energy to do that. Anything that requires energy is going to be not a spontaneous reaction. So not a spontaneous process. Another reaction of something not spontaneous would be this energy curve. Here's a reaction. I keep messing that up. So if you have very little energy in reactants, and then you make products with a lot of energy, that also is going to require energy. That would be non-spontaneous. Okay, so you might think, well, if the universe is always increasing in entropy, always becoming more disordered, then how does life form? Because life is very highly ordered. Here's some plant. It's beautiful. And it's just got this just fantastic like whirl of all these, I don't know, leaves or petals or whatever they are, spikes. Um, you can make things more ordered. You can go sort of against that second law by making things more ordered if there's an energy input. So life or cells create ordered structures from less ordered materials using energy. That doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics because the energy in the universe can still be increasing even if I'm taking some energy in and ordering my body, right? I've still lost lots of heat. That increases the disorder of the universe, even though my body is ordered because I have like the cartilage cells where they need to be and the bone cells where they need to be. So the evolution of more complex organisms does not violate the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy or disorder can decrease in an organism, but increase in the total universe. Okay, next idea is free energy. So free energy is given by the symbol delta G, and you don't have to know that anymore. So we used to have to do a little bit of math with this, but they've changed the curriculum, so you don't need to, but you still need to get the concepts. So this idea of free energy, it's the change in energy of a reaction, and it tells us whether the reaction is spontaneous or not. So spontaneous, again, does not mean that it's a fast reaction. It just means that it's thermodynamically favorable. So here's a person up on a diving board, and then they're falling down, right? So a spontaneous change would be this one, where you go from up at the top down here to the bottom. That's a spontaneous reaction. To go back up to the top of the diving board, you have to put in energy. That would be not a spontaneous reaction. So if you have a spontaneous reaction, what you end up with, the products are going to have less free energy, they're going to be more stable and less capable of doing work. So let's say, for example, that you have glucose and you break it down, maybe you use oxygen too, and you end up with carbon dioxide and water over here. Gotta put oxygen over here. Okay. So these have less free energy, less energy to be able to do work. More stable because you just don't really make much from this, whereas glucose can be broken apart into a bunch of different ways. These are less capable of doing work than the glucose is. So the free energy, I guess I should define that on here. Um, so here are the reactants, right? This is energy. Here are the reactants, here are the products. The free energy is, whoops, sorry, I want to change my color here. I can't do it. Okay, the free energy is the amount of energy, that's this stuff over here, right, between the reactants and the products. This would be your free energy right here, and that's the amount of energy you can use to do work. So examples of that would be the person falling down here, lots of energy up here, not so much here. If you have a bunch of particles together and then they diffuse out, this one, it's spontaneously going to spread out, right? So this is more ordered, that's more spread out. Same thing here. So this might be some chemical, and then it's broken down here. So a chemical reaction will start with a molecule with lots of energy and then break it down to molecules with less energy sometimes. And when that happens, that's a spontaneous reaction. Okay, so I've drawn this before. But I showed it more like this. And so instead of having a line graph, if you have bars, you can do that too. So if these are the reactants, I'm showing you that here. I'm not showing the transition state with this particular graph, but I am showing the products. Here are the products. So if you have a reactant with lots of energy, like for example, glucose, and you end up with products with less energy, right? There's a lot of energy between here and here. All that energy, right, that can be used to do something else. We call that free energy, which is a little bit beyond the scope, but I do want you to understand, if you see this graph, I want you to know that energy has been released. So this is an energy releasing reaction. Energy releasing reactions are spontaneous. It doesn't mean fast, it just means that they are thermodynamically feasible. You start with lots of energy and then you release energy by the time you make the products. The opposite is this, and I think I showed you the other day, and I drew it more like this with a line instead, with the reactants and the products. Here's energy, here's the progress of the reaction that way. Transition states here. I'm not showing you the transition state with this graph, but here's the free energy. You start with the reactants and you have to add energy into the system in order to make the products. Whenever you add energy in, this is a non-spontaneous reaction. Energy is required to do this. Spontaneous processes can be harnessed to perform work. So that's this idea of energy coupling. So energy coupling is the use of an energy releasing process to drive an energy requiring process. So let me show you that. So let's say you do cellular respiration. Let's get a brighter color so you can see it. So this is going to be the amount of energy, and here's the progress of the reaction. And let's say you do start out with glucose. They have a lot of energy in glucose, and then it's broken down to carbon dioxide and water. Less energy. Energy is released when you do that. And so that energy, when you go from lots of energy in the reactants to not so much in the products, energy is released, right? And you can use that energy to drive another process. So this process is cellular respiration. And I can use that to drive another process that's going to start with not very much energy. And you're going to need to put energy into the system in order for the reaction to happen. So the energy made here is going to be used to drive this reaction. And in this reaction, what I might do is I might start with ADP and P and make ATP. Cool, right? And then now that I have that ATP, I have another one. I'm going to take that ATP and I'm going to break it down. Oh my God, why am I bothering? I'm bothering because lots of parts of your body, your muscles, your nerves, your cell membranes, they can use ATP to drive the next reaction. Man, I wish I had a little more space here. I'm going to have to draw it underneath. So the ATP being breaking down to ADP is releasing more energy. And that energy is going to be used to drive another reaction. So maybe this other reaction, I'll draw it right here. Whoops. Maybe this other reaction is, oh, I don't know, contracting a muscle or something. So to contract a muscle, you're going to have to put energy in, or to move sodium outside of the muscle cell or nerve cell, or to build a protein. Let's say you're building a protein, you start with amino acids and you put them together and you make a protein. That requires energy. Where do you get the energy? Well, you can get it from ATP. So that energy is used to drive this process. So that's a lot of energy coupling. You do cellular respiration and the energy released from glucose is used to make ATP. And then ATP is broken down and the energy released when ATP is broken down is used to drive this other process. So consider every single thing your body has to do, and the vast majority of it is using ATP. So ATP is this energy coupler between exergonic reactions, like this one, and endergonic reactions, like that one. All right, so energy coupling is the use of an energy releasing process to drive an energy requiring process. So again, energy releasing process is like this, where the reactants have more energy than the products. And this is the reaction moving this way. And so you use the energy released here to drive some energy requiring process, right? Here's the energy releasing process. Here's the energy requiring process. Most of the energy coupling in your cells is mediated by ATP. So what is ATP? It is adenosine triphosphate. And so there's a sugar, and not just one phosphate, but a bunch of them, and a base. That's actually a nucleotide. Notice the sugar is ribose, not deoxyribose, so it's an RNA nucleotide. And you've got three phosphate groups here. It's all covalently bonded, but there's lots of negative charges here. And remember, negative charges repel, so ATP is pretty unstable. It's likely to break down to ADP. So energy is released from ATP when the terminal, meaning the last phosphate bond, is broken, and bonds in water are broken, and you form new bonds. So what you're doing is breaking this bond right here. And breaking bonds actually requires energy, but when you also break water and then put an OH on one side and H on the other side, all of those making bonds and breaking bonds all together is making ADP, which has a lower amount of energy. So altogether it releases energy. It's actually more stable. ADP, that's this one, ADP, diphosphate, right? Just two phosphates. ATP, triphosphate. right? 3 phosphates. Anyway, ADP, that's this one, is thermodynamically more stable than ATP. So it's the breaking bonds and forming new bonds that is able to release this energy to drive a lot of other processes. So I sort of like this one because it's showing you ATP and water and how you're breaking a bond here and here, but then you're forming new bonds. And so it's the whole thing together. When ATP is broken, other bonds are formed, which releases energy altogether. So ADP, the whole thing ends up at a lower energy state. Okay, so in a cell, the energy from the energy releasing reaction of ATP hydrolysis can be used to drive any energy requiring reaction in the body overall. And this is called energy coupling. So for example, let's say you're moving sodium in one direction and you're moving potassium in another direction. That is active transport. Remember, this is a protein pump, which requires ATP. Your ATP is the red dot right here that's coming over. And what it does is it phosphorylates the protein pump here. And phosphorylation means you've got a P with an O with another O. I think that's probably a negative sign with another O, maybe another negative. You've added a phosphate group onto it, which changes its shape. Because remember, this thing here is this protein pump is a protein. It's a physical thing. If you stick a phosphate group or something else on it, it might change the shape. And all you're doing is changing the shape to move the sodium in one direction and the potassium in the other direction. You don't have to memorize this one, but it's just one example of what ATP does. So our bodies, our cells have evolved to use ATP. And so that, like this protein pump, sugar can't attach. Sugar can't attach right here. Amino acids can't attach. Fats can't attach. But you can take the sugars, the fats, the amino acids, and break them down in the mitochondria to make ATP, and the ATP can do the job. So ATP is really the currency. It's the thing that your cells use directly for energy. And every other form of energy has to be converted to ATP. I think I have another example. Here's some random chemical reaction. Glutamic acid and ammonia make glutamine. And so it requires ATP to do that. And so what you see happening here, let me get the thing out of the way here. This reaction requires energy. This plus 3.4 means it requires energy, which is a little more than you need to know. But notice right here, what you're doing, can I touch? Oops. What you're doing here is phosphorylating the intermediate. Intermediate is the middleman. So here are the reactants. And you can see them here. And here's the products, which is this, right? And here's some intermediated, some middleman. And it's been phosphorylated because the ATP has stuck one of the phosphate groups onto the glutamate. And that changes its shape, which makes the whole thing a little bit more thermodynamically easier to do. And so when you do this reaction, it requires 3+ kilocalories, but when you break ATP to ADP, it releases 7.3. So overall, it is thermodynamically favorable. And you don't have to remember which is positive and which is negative, but just know that ATP is an intermediate here. It helps. So if you see the term ATP hydrolysis, right? You're breaking something and using water to break it. ATP hydrolysis just means you're taking ATP, breaking it down to ADP plus an extra phosphate group. All right, this term phosphorylated intermediate, we'll use that a lot. It just means you've got a middleman here with a phosphate group on it, P's and O's, phosphate and oxygen. Another reaction is, or another example, I kind of showed you this one already, but when you have a transport protein, ATP will often phosphorylate it, which changes its shape, and then you'll need another ATP to change it back to the way it was before. You might have seen the little motor proteins moving vesicles or other materials around in a cell. They were like the cutest thing in that video that we watched a little bit ago. It takes ATP every time these legs move, which is kind of cool. I have a video that I'm going to put in the description that I want you to watch. That you don't need to know everything about muscle contraction, but I want you to see how ATP is involved in moving in moving the parts of the muscle cell together. All right, so regeneration of ATP. So how does the whole thing work? What's the big picture? You use ATP. Sorry. You use ATP for pretty much like almost every reaction that your body needs to do. Moving a muscle, shoving sodium out of a cell, shoving calcium into the endoplasmic reticulum, pretty much like building proteins, doing everything you need to do pretty much requires ATP. ATP gets broken down to ADP because, right, this is a sugar and a base, and then the TP means there's 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups. So if you break this bond and break some water and put some OHs on, you're going to have ADP, which is the same thing, but only 2 phosphates instead, right? And so you lose some energy as heat because of that second law of thermodynamics. And then you've got a bunch of ADP around that you can't do much with. So you do cellular respiration and you make more ATP. And then you use ATP to drive all your processes. And then your mitochondria says, hey, we've got these ADP, let's break down sugar and make more ATP. And then you use them and then you have this left over, and then you do cellular respiration and you make more ATP, etc., etc. So your amount of ATP in the cell is not huge. You're constantly using it and making more, using it and making more. So thankfully, you've got your mitochondria in your cells to do this process for you. So ATP is this renewable resource. You regenerate it by putting a phosphate group onto ADP.